Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of Science of Business podcast. Today, my guest is Professor John Antonakis from University of Lausanne and editor-in-chief of one of my favorite journals, the Leadership Quarterly. Good afternoon.
Hi.
We have the topic of charisma for today, and I have plenty of questions to ask you, so I would just jump into them. And when thinking of charisma, we can identify, we can tell this person is charismatic, in my opinion, this leader is charismatic, this speech was charismatic. But then if we try to figure out why do we think so, it gets a bit tricky. So I wonder, from your experience in research, how do you define charisma?
So thank you very much for inviting me on your show. So let's begin by saying that it's very difficult to first identify and to define what charisma is. So I think generally people may probably have a notion of what charisma is, but that notion is going to be seriously confounded by many factors, including how the person looks, how smart the person is, their personality. So all these things may feed into a person's charismatic behavior. If one tries to use perceptions to model charisma, one has to understand all the factors that feed into it. So we took another perspective in how to identify what charisma is by actually identifying specific behaviors that leaders do that makes them seem more charismatic, independent of how they look or other factors. So we define charisma as symbolic, value-based, and emotional laden leader signaling. So we're talking about symbols. Can you speak in symbolic ways? In other words, trigger images and provide analogies and make themes very vivid so that people can see, can touch, can smell what you're talking about. Second component is, are you defending a set of values? What's the raison d'être? Why are we doing it? And then the third, it has to do with emotional engagement of the leader, the confidence they signal, the emotions they signal. So all three components are very important. The emotional component is very much rooted in what values are being defended and how symbolically the leader communicates. So typically speaking, if we just have the text to analyze of a leader, we can do a pretty good job of predicting whether people see the leader as charismatic. So we can measure charisma in actual speeches of leaders and actual interactions, whether they are face-to-face, via TV, via TED, whatever, it doesn't matter. But more importantly, as Kurt Lewin said, if you want to understand something, you need to try and change it. I've been doing a lot of experimental work where we take the same person and then we deliver two versions of a speech, one using these techniques, another one not, but giving the same content. So we hold the content constant, what the leader is asking the follower to do constant, but one has got more charismatic techniques than the other. So I think we have a pretty good idea on what it is and whether it matters and how to measure it. I've been working on this topic, at least last 12, 15 years.
Wow. Okay. It's already something it twisted my perspective, because indeed I was thinking, so when we think of the famous charismatic speeches, it's also a lot about the appearance, the gestures, the context. The Martin Luther King speech in Washington. So the entire atmosphere around. I'm not sure if it was Washington. I need to check that later on. But the entire context of how it came up to the speech also built up the my perception of what charisma is. But you are trying to focus on the things that we are in control of, in a sense. Is that right?
Yeah. And just as a case in point, it was at the gates of the Lincoln Memorial where he delivered the speech. And that speech, if I coded using my deep neural networks, it's very, very, very charismatic speech. So the words that he spoke, whether it was in that context or in another context, it would have still signaled very strongly his charisma. And interestingly, if I take almost any speech from Martin Luther King, and I examine it in my deep neural networks, which we've trained to actually code for these techniques. Obviously, we used humans first to do it, and then we trained the machine. It's extremely charismatic. Martin Luther King had a good voice, deep. He spoke rhythmically. But he didn't, the emotional delivery was not so strong. The gesturing was not so strong. But of course, it was very symbolic. He was speaking at the gates of Lincoln Memorial, and he started off by saying, 40 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, which was Lincoln, signed the Emancipation Declaration. So there was strong symbolism surrounding the talk. There were a lot of people, and he delivered an absolutely brilliant speech. And yeah, the charisma of the leader also spreads around. If people react, it may make other people react. So, when there's an audience, I think it can probably magnify the charismatic effect that spreads by contagion.
Wow. Okay. So it gives me a sense that we can really learn to be charismatic. And I think my biggest goal for today will be to get some tips from you on how to do that. But before we go into those practicalities, I'm also very curious about your decision-making scheme. So how did you come up to a conclusion charisma is something to investigate more and dedicate so much of your life into?
Well, it wasn't something that I had consciously thought about to do before I started studying it. I sort of stumbled across this. I was studying leadership in general. That was my PhD was on that, and I focused on psychometrics and measuring people's perceptions of leaders using questionnaire measures. I don't do that anymore. I think it's not a good way to do research. Given the problem that I told you, that these perceptions are very endogenous, meaning they depend on so many unmodeled factors that one cannot possibly control for all of them. So I was tenured in 2005, I think, or 6, somewhere there. And a friend of mine sent me an article that was published in the journal Science that showed that researchers could predict who could win election races by rating the faces of the winner and runner-up. And this really bothered me because as a professor of leadership, if your ability to lead already depends on how attractive or symmetrical you are, or how competent you look, what is it that I can teach people? So I was motivated to try to understand what we can do beyond initial impressions. So a lot of the research that I did was to try to understand perceptions and initial impressions, and they really do matter. I managed to replicate the study, and I actually replicated using even young children. I talk about it in my TEDx talk. Whoever's interested can go look on YouTube. It's on TEDx. The title is "Let's Face It, Charisma Matters." And so, I started by studying face effects and first impressions and how they can affect how much influence one gets. There's a lot of literature in economics on what they call the beauty premium. So that is the positive benefits that individuals get that look good. Can be reinforcing, can be create self-fulfilling prophecies, many mechanisms that may explain that. But my idea was, can we take a person who has a particular look, who's reasonably smart, and train them to be more charismatic, and will this person be seen very differently as a function of how much charisma they signal? And that's what I did in a paper we published in 2011, Can Charisma Be Taught? Where we did 2 experiments. One was a randomized field experiment, and the second was a laboratory experiment. And in the second experiment, we showed the same person having their natural level of charisma, which we boosted. Were they seen in a different way as a function of these what we call charismatic leadership techniques? So that's how I stumbled on it, because I thought it's unfair. We don't choose how we look. And how we look affects how other people see us, and I just think it's very, very unfair, because that's the dice of nature that affect our looks. Of course, it also affects other things like our intelligence or our personality to some extent. But holding constant all these factors by educating people, by training them in rhetoric. Can we make them more charismatic? The answer is yes, but I must make a proviso there. Not just anyone can benefit from this. You really have to have some level of smarts and intelligence to be able to do this. It's not an easy thing. It's not like putting a yellow hat on your head. If charisma was so simple as putting a yellow hat on the head, no one would be able to distinguish anyone from charisma. So charisma is costly. It's not easy to show, but to the extent that someone is willing to invest time and is reasonably smart, they will be able to produce this charismatic signal.
And just coming back for a second, you mentioned this research involving like even kids can recognize charisma. Is
Not
it the one?
charisma. There wasn't charisma. It was whether someone would win an election.
Yeah, yeah. Or yeah, true, exactly. So that's the one. I got very intrigued by it. That like you were sharing pictures of two candidates, and then based on the picture, they were predicting like whom would they choose, right? It's
Yeah,
that.
yeah. So we had the winner and the runner-up, which we randomized, left and right, and we did it for many elections. So adults choosing who looks more competent or more intelligent or more leader-like, their choices we mapped also on what kids would do after they played a game, and where we primed the captain metaphor, and then we asked them who would they choose to be a captain of the boat. So the kids' choices were very similar to the adults' choices, and both of them, 7 out of 10 times at the individual level, they chose correctly. In other words, who actually won the election. So it turns out those are for elections where you don't have a lot of information on candidates, so parliamentary elections. So there, of course, people will go with first impression because they don't really know who the people are, what they stand for. Modeling election races depends on the information richness also. Presidential elections work in a completely different way. We have a paper on that in the Academy of Management Journal where we show that the state of the economy, who's the incumbent, how long they have been in, and also the charisma difference of the two candidates then predicts very well who will likely win. There, the face doesn't work so well. I did do a little pilot study with kids, and, it's about 55-45. So about, 55 out of 100 times they will choose correctly. It's just slightly better than chance. So I don't think there's anything in that. Definitely in the where there's a lot of information on the candidates, the economy and other things matter a lot more.
Yeah, I think this is when I've seen this paper, I was recently drawn to our previous presidential elections where we had two candidates that were very similar in terms of how they present themselves on pictures and so on. But but one was, to my opinion, a bit more visually appealing as a president. Let's put it in this way. They still lost. So, which would mean that there is something more to it than just the looks, than just the charisma, and probably that's what you cover in this paper. So another one I need to read on, and I think we are ready to really dive deeper into the specific practices, specific tactics that we can implement when we want to be more charismatic. I think you mentioned a little bit about it, and as far as I know, that's how we call them, right? Charismatic leadership tactics.
Yeah.
So could you maybe elaborate more on, what exactly can we do to boost our charisma? What should we focus on when designing the way we will speak, the way we will present in front of an audience?
Well, I teach over a whole semester my EMBA students on how to do this, so it's not something I can say in 5 minutes, but I can give a basic gist. So about learning charisma and teaching it, I guess we'll focus a little bit more on that later. So what other techniques now you'd like to know a bit more about? So there are three essential components of charisma. One is delivery, and I'll leave that to last. That's, let's say, the icing on the cake. But the cake is really composed of two essential ingredients: framing and substance. Framing is directing people's attention on the message, and substance is what are we doing and why are we doing it. So in framing, probably the most important component is generating symbolic meanings via metaphors and storytelling. So speaking metaphorically is very important because people understand it. It provides an analogy. It's easy to remember. So, when, let's take Martin Luther King that you mentioned before, Radek, when he said, in a sense, we've come to the nation's capital to cash a check. Now, obviously, people didn't go to the nation's capital to cash a check, but, he's saying, in a sense, we've come to cash a check. When the architects of our republic signed the magnificent words of the Constitution, they were promising everyone, the certain inalienable rights. And then he said, insofar as the Negro people are concerned, we have received a bad check, a check marked insufficient funds. Now, everyone can understand what it means because you use a metaphor, especially in those days where checks were widely used. Perhaps young people today don't know what a check is because it doesn't exist anymore. But, if one is able to explain something complicated like the Constitution and some legal aspects in a way that anyone can understand, then you get the point across. And it also means you know what you're talking about. You've managed to find something that is very hard to convey. So, he continued, we refuse to believe that our Bank of Justice is bankrupt. He could have said it in a legal speak, but, no one would understand. It wouldn't be interesting. So it sounds poetic. It provides a visual, and it also says that this person knows what they're talking about. Like, I don't know, Einstein, when he tried to explain, he did very well explain that gravity is merely acceleration towards an object. And, if you just say this to a person that, gravity is acceleration, it's like, what are you talking about? And he used a very powerful metaphor. Imagine you're in a lift in space and you're in the middle of the lift and the lift is not moving. So you're stuck in the middle, suspended, and, you're very far from any gravitational pull. So you're just sitting there, not moving, the lift's not moving. Now imagine there are rockets on the bottom of the lift and the lift starts accelerating and you're in the middle, and if the lift's accelerating, it's going to push you up and you'll be able to walk and you'll experience gravity or something akin to gravity. You're not experiencing any gravity, you're experiencing acceleration. Something is pushing your legs down so you can walk and it feels like you're experiencing gravity. So, to be able to come up with these metaphors, you better know your subject extremely well. And the metaphor, if it doesn't make sense, then the person won't understand it. So you see, it's not easy to be able to produce metaphors that make sense. So, that's what we look for. And yep.
And I wonder, so like, probably they should also be meaningful to the audience. Like the more they are attached to them, the stronger the message.
Exactly. I mean, if I produce a metaphor that makes no sense so people can't understand, then I've lost them. So, metaphors are very important. Stories are very important. Can I find stories and anecdotes that relate to the problem at hand, that bring it to light, that have a moral that people can understand? So, if you think about it, go back to the savannah 80,000 years or whenever people started speaking. Sorry, but perhaps it wasn't 80,000 years. I don't know, tens of thousands of years. The tribes that probably had an evolutionary fitness advantage were the ones that had leaders who were able to capture knowledge and convey it and transmit it. So how else would that be said, thousands of years ago when we didn't have books and USB sticks? It was through storytelling, through metaphors, through proverbs, through symbolic meanings. So I think this is also something we've been evolved to detect and to be very attuned to. So that's why I think when someone is able to speak symbolically, we stand up and listen. It's an unusual quality, and there's probably a distribution of intelligence that allows one to produce these things. So it's probably on the high end of the intelligence scale where people have the capacity to produce this kind of rhetoric. So we have symbolic meanings produced by metaphor and stories. We have other things like I think I was showing you before we began. I was analyzing the speech of JFK, his inaugural address, ask not what your country can do for you, what you can do for your country. So it's speaking in contrast, contrasting your position against another position, making things black and white and directing people's attention. Using three-part lists, we're here to do this, this, and that, or four-part lists. Again, it focuses attention, it makes it easy to remember, and it gives an impression of completeness. And then asking, rhetorical questions. So there are those who are asking, when will the Negro people be satisfied? Posing a question and then answering the question. Again, I'm quoting what Martin Luther King said. The term Negro obviously is a derogatory term today. I'm just quoting what he said at the time he did. So posing rhetorical questions can also create an intrigue, a puzzle that you will answer, or it can give the answer immediately. Like, what is it like if you're a mother, in a basement and holding your kids at 2:00 in the morning and hearing Russian bombs going on around you? No one has to answer that question. You just pose it with the answer being evident. What is it like if your kids go to bed one more night and don't have a hot meal? So rhetorical questions can be used to provide an answer immediately or to pose an intrigue that will be answered later. Like, what is charisma? Can we learn it? If we signal charisma, will we be able to be more effective? Now, I'm not going to answer that right now. I might answer it later, but at least it's created a puzzle in your head. So that's what framing is about. And then there's substance. So the substance has to do with, what are the values you're defending? What's right? What's wrong? What's good? What's bad? What should we do? What we should not do? So, again, with Martin Luther King, he repeated over and over again, it's not right that, African Americans don't have the same rights as whites do. He repeated, over and over again, that we are languishing on a lonely island of poverty in a sea of material prosperity, chained manacled by the chains of discrimination. A lot of strong themes, also metaphorically delivered, but showing that it's not right what's going on. It's not good what's going on. This is not what we should do. So signaling very strongly your values, at the same time signaling that you understand what people feel like. So that's what I call cognitive empathy. Can you put into words what people are thinking, what people are hoping for, what people would like, or what people believe, and embracing and acknowledging those feelings, not denying them, and then using those then to move forward and linking them in the vision in some way that will give people hope and make them feel confident and make them feel worthy and make them feel like they can accomplish something. So
I wonder,
yeah,
just in here, so in in the topics of social injustice, in the topics that really move people, it feels very easy to show the values, to stand in one or the other camp. But I wonder if there is something for like using the same techniques, but for some things that are not that emotional, like data, like speaking science even. How do we present the values in topics that are not that um emotionally driven in a sense?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I'm glad you asked it, because in fact everything we do does have a value-based component. I teach statistics, causal analysis at the PhD level, and I make very clear to my students the moral and ethical responsibility they have to do research that's robust so that they can inform policy correctly. And I show them what happens when we have failure of science. We can't replicate what we're doing, and it's not robust, and it has absolutely zero policy implications. So whether you are defending political values, whether you're producing a paperclip, a bottle top, or whether you're teaching science or law or anything, everything has got moral implications. How you do it, how you treat the people, what kind of knowledge you produce, the actions you produce, the whole value chain, how is this process driven, what is its impact on others, on the environment. So I would be hard pressed to find any activity done by any human in any field that doesn't have values attached to it. The problem is this: leaders don't often realize what their values are, and they don't often talk about them explicitly. So this is something that I make very explicit, which is what makes charismatic leaders unusual, is that they do bring those values to the fore. We usually expect that from politicians, but it shouldn't be the case. It's every single thing we do has got values attached to it. So, even if we teach statistics, we can put values to it. And I guess it's a long story why I teach statistics, but if we have time, I'll come back to that. Anyway, and then so I talked about values, I talked about collective sentiments, and then there's also what is the strategic goal we are doing. And of course, a leader has to know what they're talking about before they communicate a strategic goal, because if that strategic goal is not met, they're going to look like an idiot. So, it's costly to communicate your values, because if people don't agree with that, they will not follow you. It's also costly communicating ambitious goals. Now, I could be the most charismatic guy on the planet, and I might give you a super charismatic speech to motivate you to run the 100 meters in under 8 seconds. And you might try and you'll fail, and you might try again and you'll fail, and I might motivate you again. But, after failing 20 times, because that even Usain Bolt can't run the 100 meters in under 8 seconds, I'm going to look like an idiot. So again, you need to have very good insights and be a good expert in the system to start using these techniques, because you can't just communicate any kind of goals. You need to know what's realizable and what is possible. So, the goal must provide aim, must be ambitious, must be achievable. And then the last aspect is signaling your confidence that this goal can be reached. So those are the two major aspects. So framing is the symbolic meanings attracting attention. Substance is what we're doing, why, and focusing on the morals and on the collective sentiments. And then the final thing is delivery. That's the nonverbal, the use of voice, gesturing, nonverbal signaling. And there's a myth. Let me quickly put this on the table, that 94% or whatever of communication nonverbal is absolutely not true. What is true is that if we don't have access to hearing what a person says, then the look will matter. Obviously, I've shown that myself. I've published a paper in Science that shows that. If you only have thin slices, then nonverbal may matter. But as soon as a person starts talking, then you know that will override whatever delivery you have. I mean, if you have some idiot saying complete rubbish in a very charismatic way, you're not going to listen to him or her. So you know, and we talk about that also in a paper we just recently published where we analyze TED Talks, and we can predict very well which TED Talk will go viral just on the basis of the speech, and holding constant how the person looks and controlling for voice and gesturing and all that. When we have a horse race between gesturing and the verbal beats it completely. The reason is because if I'm speaking metaphorically, if I'm speaking values, then nonverbal behavior will more likely co-occur with this. If nonverbal behavior occurs and there's absolutely no substance in the talk, it's not going to matter. If there is good substance in the talk, then whether or not you have nonverbal behavior, you know, if you have it, it will strengthen the talk. So I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but it's like the glaçage, you know, the icing on the cake, but you can't just eat the icing. That was a metaphor, by the way.
Well, yeah, I just like before I move on, I also wanted to point out, like after reading your paper and reading this charismatic leadership tactics, I started to note them more often. Just like, you know, just like when you get to know about the rhetoric and you start to see that in movies. I had the same. And recently, I was speaking with one of my clients, the CEO, and I realized, so he told me about the training that we will be doing, and he said, so we are getting there in 4 different charts, and we want to come back in one. In 4 boats, we're coming back in 1 boat. So just and I just pointed
That
out
was
to
a
him.
nice
So
metaphor. Yeah.
yeah, that's how you speak charisma, and that's how you actually use that. And he wasn't actually aware of that. So you know, building it probably through some observation, through some social context. He wasn't trained, and he kind of naturally figured out how to speak to people so they are inspired, they are willing to follow. But it's good that we actually know how it happens. So now
Yeah.
it's
I see that a lot, Radek. That you know, when I train managers, the natural level of managers, you know, some is higher than others. Some have a higher level than others, and you know, oftentimes the ones that are pretty charismatic don't even realize what they do to. I mean, they know they're charismatic. They know they have an influence over others. They know that people see them as that, but oftentimes they don't even know why they are seen like that. It's funny. My father did that a lot. He was a local kind of political leader in South Africa, and I know, and I remember, and I've also looked at some of the stuff that he did. Was really full of metaphor, you know. And I asked him, "How do you know about that?" Well, he didn't know. He just emulated leaders that he had heard speaking who were charismatic, and lo and behold, he was using a lot of these techniques without even realizing it.
that's also optimistic to some way, that sometimes we are not really starting from scratch. Sometimes we do have some of those ingredients. And now I wanted to talk with you about how to learn this charisma. And especially, I know your paper from 2011, you mentioned already, this Can Charisma Be Taught? And I got amused by the technique that you're using there. And just let me tell you how I understood that, because I'm also really into learning and teaching, and this really, it blew my mind that you can train people in this way to be that. I find it very engaging, fun, and still you use the paper, you use the experiment to show that it's also effective. So what I understood is that you used some of the charismatic speeches that are recorded. I'm not sure if from movies or from some political leaders' speeches. And then what participants were doing during the training, they were emulating, they were mirroring the speech. Is that so? And then if you could tell me, like, how did you come up with it? How did it actually work in the training?
So in the training, usually what I do is I create an intrigue about, you know, what charisma is, and you know, most people think it's some kind of mystical quality, and we start off by showing how appearances can matter, and make people seem more influential. And then, the $1 million question is, people, when they first look at us, they size us up, they look at our age, sex, height, and put a price on our tag. If we look like $1 million, they fill in the blanks and assume we have lots of positive characteristics. Can we change the price people put on our tags? And then I switch I present, the little video case studies of a leader who, one who's maybe very charismatic and one who's not, one who uses more carrots and sticks and one who uses more words to motivate. And then I ask participants to, describe why these two leaders are different. Typically, they look at the outcome. I like this person. He's warmer. He's this. He's that. But they don't really see what it is that makes the person more charismatic. They don't at all identify the use of metaphor and values and contrast and questions. These things just go right by them. And then what I do is I formally explain the theory of charisma, the definition of charisma, and then the techniques. And then we go back and we watch the videos again, and then we stop sentence by sentence to identify where there's a technique. So when I have more time and I can train students or managers in a longer time frame, then we may look at Martin Luther King's speech and sentence by sentence go through it so that they get accustomed to identifying the techniques first, because to produce it is very difficult if you don't know what it is exactly. So they then become experts in identifying. Here's a metaphor, here's a contrast, here's a 3-part list, here's a question, and then we show a few more video scenes so that they become really well versed in understanding the importance of it. I also show them the economic impact. So I've done lots of experiments and I've estimated how much it will bring you if you're more charismatic. So, there's so many consultants out there. There's so many people who say so much. And, a lot of people, I might be super charismatic and explaining to you something, but I could be selling snake oil to you and it wouldn't work. So, I also tell my participants to have a healthy dosage of skepticism when they hear anything. And, what's the evidence? How do you know it works? So I use a lot of science to actually demonstrate that these things work and why they work. If you're going to convince someone to get vaccinated against COVID, one of the best things is to explain how it works and then also show evidence how it works. So I do that a lot. I present lots of evidence, and then if I have time, then I get them to record a speech. And they try to deliver it and use themes that are charismatic. We use peer-to-peer feedback where other people watch the speech and then try to code the techniques and see how well they do, and then they try again. There's also an article I have in the Harvard Business Review, which is called, I think, Learning Charisma. So if your viewers just Google Learning Charisma, John Antonakis, you will fall on the Harvard Business Review page. I think you can download 5 articles for free per month. So they can download mine. And in that article also, we explain all these things. We write the article also in a way that uses the techniques. And those of you who might start reading that article, you'll see it's very easy to read because we use the very techniques we profess. So it does take time. It takes practice. One can't just, snap their finger and become more charismatic. But, like learning to run, 10 kilometers and then 20 kilometers and a marathon, if one is reasonably well constituted physically, one can do it, but it takes a lot of effort and a lot of practice. It's the same with charisma.
So firstly, to identify, to learn how to see that a specific technique was used, then to learn how to design it, how to craft it, and then to practice the delivery and to get feedback, peer feedback on how did you go. So actually, while peer feedbacking, you're also learning to identify.
Exactly, and not only that, it's also like carrying, the ring of Frodo. Do you know the Lord of the Rings?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So once you have this knowledge, it's there, and it's a big burden because you will see yourselves when you start using these techniques that people will react to you. So, it's really important also that one uses it to do good, ideally. So I don't just work with anyone and any kind of company. And then the other thing is, like you said earlier, you start seeing it everywhere. So I think the biggest learning opportunities anyone has once they know these things is they start seeing in movies, in politicians, CEOs using these techniques and how people react to them. depending on who your audience is also, you may or may not come across as charismatic. So you could signal charisma all you want if you're Barack Obama, but if you're going down to Oklahoma in some rural county, they're not going to listen to you because they're extremely conservative. If Trump goes there, even though he's not so charismatic, they're going to love him. Obama is going to be looked like a clown. Trump in New York or in Los Angeles will be seen like a clown because they don't agree with his values. So, also what really matters is, can you read your audience, and do you know also, what they stand for? And there's no way that Obama is going to move anyone in Oklahoma or in rural Texas, because there's such a big divide in the values that he is signaling and what they expect. And it would be dishonest for him to not share his values. So, by sharing your values, you make yourself very vulnerable. And I think that also makes you more trustworthy, but it also signals to your enemies what you stand for. And I think it's the most honest thing to do. So, whether or not I like Trump, and I don't, at least he was, mostly honest about what he stood for. I mean, although he's very confused about the realities in life, and who won the election and was it rigged and all that. But what he defended, I guess he transmitted quite transparently. Although he was not transparent on other things.
That's interesting. It's also something I think I read in some paper about influencers on social media, is that only those who actually present some value, something you can agree or disagree with, are the ones that usually bring more attention. So either some people are attracted to them, some people are opposed, but basically those who are willing to start being influencers, they need to get over this safety zone of just not sharing any of your views, any of your opinions, because that's that's not where you actually make any change, make any influence, if if it's not fashion, but just some of the views, like political views, influencers. We have plenty of them in Poland.
Also, so that if you're charismatic and you do signal your values transparently, you will either be loved or loathed. Basically, that's what's going to happen.
Wow, I wonder. So I think we made it clear, and thank you for that, because this is really interesting also to notice, is that so when we want to work on our charisma, it's more important to work on the rhetorics, to work on how do we speak and what do we say, and this delivery is just a spicing on an icing, as we use this metaphor. I wonder though, like from everything, in terms of gestures, in terms of tone, did you spot some particular factors that are more important than the others? Like when we have all the work done on rhetorics and we want to start improving the delivery, what should we focus on?
Well, I would say probably voice and speaking rhythmically, and and putting some variability in one's voice. If one just speaks completely flat, that makes it more difficult. But still, people like Mandela or Gandhi or Margaret Thatcher, their voice delivery was very, very poor, but yet they were still seen very charismatic because the way they spoke, what they said is extremely rhetorically rich. So I would say probably voice matters more. Nonverbal behavior, if you are sure about what you're discussing, it comes out just naturally. And I do this very often. I get people to speak to each other. And the other day I did it with a bunch of Finnish managers. And, the Finns are not so renowned for their nonverbal expressiveness. Yet I've done this in Nordic countries, Lithuania recently, where they all claim that they're not very expressive. But, if I ask two people to speak and, I tell one, explain the most important event in your childhood that made you who you are or whatever, I ask them to speak about. And, they talk about something personal that will recount and they will recount an anecdote. Nonverbal behavior just naturally comes out. And I secretly film them with my phone, and then I play back to them and I show them just how naturally expressive they are. So I don't even need to work on that. If you're talking in a bar, or you're talking to your grandmother or to your grandfather or to a friend or what have you, body language just comes out naturally. It's just that people get very nervous and very stiff when they speak in front of an audience, when they speak in front of a camera, on the radio, or what have you. And because of this nervousness, it kind of locks them up, and they can't really express themselves. So I think when the words are easily flowing, then the gestures follow very easily.
And about the speaking rhythm, what I understand from that is to have to sometimes speed up, to sometimes slow down, depending on what you're saying, to have some pauses, if that's what you mean by that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think all this will come naturally if the person has a good idea about what they're going to speak. So yeah, show some variation, pause, stop and think. If you're angry about something, really stress the point or speak slower about something. So some variation will help keep attention of the audience. So if one just speaks flat the whole time, I mean, obviously it's going to be a bit difficult. But if what you're saying is so important and you're speaking it flat, still people will listen. But it just makes it a bit harder.
All right. I have already 3 pages of notes on what to do to be more charismatic, what to focus on. And I think we can maybe conclude our conversation with one more research paper you did, the paper Just Words, Just Speeches, where you were sharing about why it is important to learn charisma. How does it benefit the economic perspective of your company? Could you maybe brief us into this research?
Yeah, so this paper is in press in the journal called Management Science, and it's work that I did with economists Christian Sender, Roberto Weber, and Giovanna Dada. And I think the most impressive part of this research is probably the first study where we set up a temporary firm. We hired workers. We were in Birmingham and we worked with Adeco. We hired temporary workers through the usual channels where they hired temporary workers to help us with a mail sorting task. And we randomized workers into different conditions. They were exposed to the experimenters that told them how to do the task and what to do. We paid them for a full day's work, to travel to Adeco, to train them, to go back home, work on this task, and then come back the next day with the fruits of their labor. But they did not know they were in an experiment. And what we did is we had an actor who gave them a 5-minute motivational speech, either charismatically or not. And when it was not charismatic, we paid fixed wage. And in another condition, we paid a bonus if they passed the critical threshold. So our interest was to see, in all conditions, they had a fixed wage. In the bonus condition, if they passed the critical threshold, we started paying them bonuses. So we calculated this critical threshold in a pilot that we did, where we saw what an average worker could do, and then we calculated how much we could pay for an extra unit. So this is really a high-powered economic bonus, the maximum we can pay, so that in the bonus condition, we keep constant the cost of every additional mail produced relative to the control group. So when we compared high power bonus condition to charisma condition, we observed that we couldn't distinguish the performance of a worker who's exposed to charisma or to bonuses. In other words, charisma produced an increase in performance as much as high-powered economic bonuses did, which is very curious. And from economic perspective, or psychological perspective, very difficult to understand. But to the extent that the speaker can signal themes that touch the person's identity and make them feel good, to help reinforce the vision of the leader, then they are intrinsically motivated to work hard for the leader. So we showed this in the field with real workers, and I don't think anyone has ever done any experiment of the sort in management or in applied psychology where you actually compare a treatment like leadership against one that's using high-powered economic bonuses. And then we also went into the lab to show that we can help 4 players who have to cooperate on a public good, where the Nash equilibrium is that every person will always defect. They will not contribute to the public good because they are worried that others will not. So they are, they're not going to take the risk to put money in a public pot. So the way that we test this notion of whether leadership can help people cooperate is you give money to the players every round. They can decide whether to put the money in the public pot or keep it. Their payoff depends on how much money they keep each round and how much everyone else puts in the public pot, which we multiplied by 0.4. So the best thing to do is that everyone contributes all their money in the public pot. and then we multiply it by 0.4, and then it goes back to everyone. So the collective interest is to cooperate on the public good. But the selfish interest is that, imagine if I'm selfish, I expect the others to, contribute to the public good, and I'm going to free ride, like the people who use public transport and never want to pay, or, that we share a field of grass, and, we have to equitably share this so that all the cows can eat a little bit, and I go in the night and I let my cows eat as much as possible. So yeah, my cows will profit, but we destroy the public good if we do this. So what we show is that with charisma, and especially in the condition where we get everyone in the lab to watch the video together, so they feel like they're in the same boat and not in 4 different boats, to use the metaphor from your CEO. When we make salient a collective identity, a charismatic leader will increase by approximately 20% the contributions to public good relative to a controlled speech. And the controlled speeches we have in all my experiments are really, they're not bad speeches. We're not comparing a medicine against the poison, because if you see a difference, is it because the medicine works and the poison kills more people? Is it because the medicine kills a lot of people and the poison kills a lot of people and the medicine doesn't work, or both kill people but the poison kills more people? So that's another problem I see in our field, is that high power posing versus low power posing. It's a medicine versus a poison, and oftentimes that there's no control group in many experiments that are done. So there's another big problem in my field, is that unfortunately the experiments are oftentimes not robustly done. There's not an appropriate control group. There's not appropriate baseline group. There are no equal demand effects that are made across treatments. So there's a lot still to be done so we can understand what leadership is. But to do that, we really need a true science of leadership. And I guess that's also why I got stuck teaching causal analysis and experimental design. I'm really passionate about properly modeling and properly testing our hypotheses. And the goal is not to try to prove what we believe is true, but to try to disprove it. So if I believe that charisma really works, okay, let's find out one of the strongest ways to motivate people, that's money. Okay, let's test it against money and see how it does.
Wow. Yeah, so I'm like, also to mention, I'm really impressed by the way you design your research, and I think that's another reason to read them through for all of the aspiring scientists listening to us, to get to know a way. Not like, what I like is not only that you really go thoroughly into figuring out your research questions, finding out if they're true or not, but also the way you're writing, that it's actually something that can be read in the evening before sleep, and won't really make us fall asleep, but really understand better what you're dealing with. So
not my statistics papers. So about 30% of what I do is applied statistics and econometrics. I think those will put you to sleep very quickly.
Thank you. And thank you very much for all the insights you shared. I wonder, if someone would like to read more, where would you send them to? How to find more of your work?
On my webpage or through Google Scholar. I think Google Scholar probably can direct you to preprints. So if one comes to my webpage at the university, most of my papers, we have put up the preprints. So I know that some journals are paywalled, and one has to pay for the articles. But usually, if you go to the professor's webpage, at least on my webpage, almost all of my publications are up online, and they're freely downloadable. It's not the final version, from the journal, but it is the final version we submitted. So all the content is in there. So I'm very happy. Also, if anyone would like to have the final versions, just email me, and I will email you the final version in PDF.
Thank you. And I think that's the conclusion. I really know a lot more about the charisma and what to pay attention to. I'm afraid a bit of this noticing it everywhere, but I think that's the perk of knowing. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Radek, for inviting me.